They wrote some of the most famous works of English literature ever, but the Brontë sisters were stalked by heartbreak and death even more severely than the characters of Cathy and Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester. Today on History Calling, we're going to look at the tragic lives and deaths of the Brontë sisters, Charlotte, Anne and Emily, as well as their forgotten siblings, and especially at why they all died so terribly young. As the video is inspired by the release of the movie Wuthering Heights, I'll also tell you a little bit about that book's creation, publication, and why it was initially received pretty badly. Just before we start in earnest, please remember to like, hype and comment on the video and subscribe with the notification bell on for more from me. It's also always worth checking if the bell is still on, even if you're already subscribed, as I get people telling me quite often that YouTube has deactivated it for some reason. For more from me, you can become a YouTube member or find me on patreon.com/historycalling, where I release bonus material every week, including patron-only podcasts. Our story begins in Emdale, County Down, in what is now Northern Ireland, so very much in my neck of the woods if you don't already know where this accent you're hearing is from. It was there that a boy named Patrick Prunty, or Brontë, spelled Brunty, was born on St. Patrick's Day in 1777. Patrick was a clever cookie and he entered St. John's College, Cambridge in 1802, at which point he changed his name to Brontë, but without the accent on the final letter. That accent had appeared, though, by 1811, and my best guess as to why he changed it was to appear more affluent and exotic than he actually was, as being an Irish Catholic in England before Catholic emancipation even happened was no walk in the park. That said, we aren't even sure if he was Catholic to begin with, as different sources I've read say different things, including that he was the child of a mixed marriage. In Northern Ireland that means one parent is Catholic, one is Protestant. It has nothing to do with skin colour. However he began, though, he ended up becoming an Anglican minister. On the 29th of December 1812, he married Maria Branwell, the niece of the headmaster of a school in which Brontë was working. The couple had 6 children together. The first two, Maria born in 1814 and Elizabeth born in 1815, both arrived in Hartshead. The family then moved to the parsonage on Market Street in Thornton, Yorkshire, where Charlotte was born on the 21st of April 1816, followed by Patrick Branwell on the 26th of June 1817, he is generally known by his middle name, Emily Jane born on the 30th of July 1818, and Anne born on the 17th of January 1820. A few months after the youngest child's arrival, the family relocated again to the village of Haworth in the Yorkshire moors, where Patrick had been made curate, a position he would hold for 41 years. In fact, he is still the longest-serving minister that church has ever had. Both he and his wife dabbled in writing, with Patrick authoring poetry and Maria writing an essay called The Advantages of Poverty in Religious Concerns. It wasn't long after that the first of numerous tragedies struck the family. No doubt worn out by relentless pregnancies and childbirths, the elder Maria fell ill and died on the 15th of September 1821. Some have suggested cancer as her cause of death, others chronic pelvic sepsis together with increasing anemia. Her sister Elizabeth Branwell, who had come from Cornwall to nurse her, now stayed on to help with the children, which was fortunate for them as Patrick's attempts to find another wife failed. She got along particularly well with Branwell and Anne, while relations with Charlotte and Emily were cordial if not quite as warm. The 4 elder girls were sent to a recently established boarding school called the Clergy Daughters' School at Cowanbridge in Lancashire, a decision which proved an absolute disaster. Conditions there were very hard, with poor food, dirty living quarters, little heating, and strict punishments. Maria and Elizabeth both became desperately ill with tuberculosis and were brought home, where they died on the 6th of May and 15th of June 1825. By then their younger sisters had also been brought back before they too could succumb to the effects of the deprivations in the school. Thereafter the children were homeschooled primarily by their aunt and father, and learnt reading, writing, needlework, some French, and the classics. They were all very well read, with few limits on the type of material they were allowed to peruse, and occasional tutors also taught them drawing and painting. They were not well prepared to operate in society, though, having relatively little contact with the outside world, and this would be particularly problematic for Emily, who, as we'll see, struggled to make social connections with people outside the family. All of the siblings began writing whilst still children, creating stories for each other, sometimes writing together, and creating things like miniature books, written in the tiniest handwriting you've ever seen, reviews, poems, and little magazines too, though their most notable creation might have been Charlotte and Branwell's Glass Town saga, in which British colonists lived in an imaginary African kingdom. The events of their early lives would clearly shape much of their later work, though. It is hard not to conclude that there was a link between Charlotte's birthplace in Thornton and Thornfield Hall, the home of the imperious Mr. Rochester in Jane Eyre. We can see too a clear link between what happened at Cowanbridge School and the loss of her sisters, and the horrendous Lowood School where Jane Eyre went, nearly died, and lost her only friend Helen Burns, who was likely inspired by Maria Brontë. The headmaster of Cowanbridge has also been seen in the character of Mr. Brocklehurst, who also appears in Jane Eyre. The frequency with which the Brontë sisters' literary characters experienced love, loss, and especially orphanhood also echoes the loss of their mother and sisters at this early age. Despite the terrible experience at Cowanbridge, Charlotte attended Margaret Wooler's school at Roe Head near Dewsbury for a year and a half between January 1831 and the summer of 1832, where she made friends with two women called Ellen Nussey and Mary Taylor, who would both later speak of Miss Bronte's awareness that she did not have good looks and would not fare well on the marriage market. In her absence, Emily, Anne and Branwell had continued their own writing, often together, with the two girls ultimately creating an imaginary Pacific island called Gondal in 1832 or 1833, of which numerous poems survive, and about which they wrote until as late as 1845. When Charlotte returned, she taught them much of what she had learned at school, and in 1833 Ellen Nussey also visited the family and left us descriptions of what some of them looked like and what their personalities were like. Emily had a lithesome, graceful figure. She was the tallest person in the house except her father. Her hair, which was naturally as beautiful as Charlotte's, was in the same unbecoming tight curl and frizz, and there was the same want of complexion. She had very beautiful eyes, kindly, kindling, liquid eyes. Sometimes they looked grey, sometimes dark blue, but she did not often look at you, she was too reserved. She talked very little. She and Anne were like twins, inseparable companions, and in the very closest sympathy which never had any interruption. As for Anne, she earned the following description. Her hair was a very pretty light brown and fell on her neck in graceful curls. She had lovely violet blue eyes, fine pencilled eyebrows, a clear, almost transparent complexion. Just to give someone else's impression of this same woman, I'll add here that later on the publisher George Smith said she was a gentle, quiet, rather subdued person, by no means pretty, yet of a pleasing appearance. The girl's brother Branwell was also something of an artist, and it is thanks to him that we have a single portrait of the three of them together, painted in around 1834. He originally included himself in it too, but later decided to remove his image, though his ghostly outline can still be seen. Aware of the need to make her own money, Charlotte contemplated a job as an artist herself. Her short-sightedness made painting miniatures seem like a possibility, but there wasn't enough money for her to train for this. Instead, she went back to Roe Head as a teacher on the 29th of July 1835, with the 17-year-old Emily in tow, who was to get a free education in exchange for her sister's work. It lasted 3 months before the shy and socially awkward future author of Wuthering Heights had to be sent back due to extreme homesickness, which not even her sister's presence could alleviate. Anne was dispatched to take her place in October and fared better, but even she only made it to December 1837 when she had to go home with what may have been asthma and gastric fever. She did return and was an accomplished pupil, just as her sister Charlotte had been, winning a prize for her good conduct. Meanwhile, back at Haworth, separation from Anne seems to have made Emily more self-sufficient when it came to her writing, and she continued to write her tales of Gondal. In September 1838, though, she took a job as a teacher in a girls' school called Law Hill near Halifax. She wrote to her sister Charlotte of the heavy workload that was foisted on her from 6 a.m. until 11 p.m. She lasted 6 months, and when she left, she told her pupils she preferred the house dog to them. She never sought paid employment outside the home again, and instead managed the household. Charlotte also hated her job. Again, we can see shades of Jane Eyre's life as a teacher at Lowood in her experiences, finding it tedious in the extreme, but she stuck it out until the end of 1838. During this time, she leaned heavily on her friend Ellen, to the point that she became somewhat obsessive about her, and continued to write poems and novellas, determined to be a published author, despite the warnings of poet laureate Robert Southey, who she wrote to asking for advice that it was not a suitable pastime for women. When she finally moved home, she continued to write, moving away from her partnership with Branwell to become more independent. As for Branwell, he tried and failed to become a portrait painter in Bradford in 1838, and by January 1840 he had taken a position as a tutor in Furness. It only lasted about half a year, and was trying to get his poems and translations published. He had little success, and other employments he took up included working as the assistant clerk in charge at the Sowerby Bridge railway station starting in October 1840. He later moved to Ludfoot on the 1st of April 1841. Back to Charlotte, who had turned down 2 marriage proposals in the first half of 1839, showing that she was not as devoid of attractions as she had seemed to think. One was from her friend Ellen's brother, the Reverend Henry Nussey. The other was from the Irish minister, the Reverend James Bryce, who was a virtual stranger. This was either a brave or a foolish move for someone with such limited options, as she was giving up the financial security that such matches would have brought her. She was not in the moderately secure financial position that Jane Austen's character Elizabeth Bennet was when she turned down the hated Reverend Collins in Pride and Prejudice, and remember that Austen had another character, Charlotte Lucas, who quickly agreed to marry Collins precisely for the security that Charlotte Brontë allowed to pass her by in these situations. Mind you, Austen herself turned down marriage proposals, so perhaps she and Charlotte Brontë were actually quite close in their views around marriage. It had to be love or nothing. Instead of wedding, Charlotte opted to become a governess for the Sidgwick family at Stonegape near Skipton that May, which she hated possibly even more than being a schoolteacher. She lasted 2 months, and we can see echoes of her attitude towards this job in the later Jane Eyre. Anne, too, was trying her hand at being a governess and having an equally bad time of it. She worked at Bleak Hall, the home of the Ingham family, between April and December 1839, but the 2 children in her care were spoilt and unmanageable. She didn't much enjoy her 5 years with the Robinson family of Thorpe Greenhall near York between 1840 and 1845 either, though she did like their family holidays to Scarborough. We can see her general disdain for this occupation reflected in her later character of Agnes Grey, and truly it is a sign of how limited the job options were for Victorian-era women of gentle birth that the Brontë sisters kept going back to education despite the fact that they often didn't enjoy it. Charlotte attempted publication in 1840 without success, and tried governessing again in March 1841 in a household near Leeds, staying until that December when she came home and she and her sisters began to contemplate opening their own school, though this would never happen. It was in pursuit of this goal, though, that Charlotte and Emily undertook what would be the biggest journey of their lives in February 1842. They persuaded their aunt, Elizabeth Branwell, to pay for them to attend a school in Brussels called the Pensionnat Heger to help to prepare them for running their own establishment, and their father took them there via London. Emily, who didn't really speak much French, hated it, though she did well in the lessons. Although the trip was only supposed to last 6 months, they were offered the opportunity to stay on to teach English in the case of Charlotte and music in the case of Emily. Meanwhile, back home, Anne suffered the grief of losing to cholera William Waitman, her father's young and handsome curate to whom she had formed an attachment, but who died on the 6th of September 1842. This loss pained Emily too, who had also become friendly with him. In fact, he, plus Charlotte's friends, Ellen and Mary, seemed to have been Emily's only friends, as she had a reputation for being a little strange, Again, this might have something to do with the very sheltered upbringing she'd had, talking mostly to family only and always absorbed in her make-believe worlds. At the end of the following month, the Brontes' aunt, Elizabeth Branwell, also expired, leaving each girl £300, and this caused the return from Brussels of Charlotte and Emily. Emily went back to managing the household, and having experienced a dry spell in her writing, her output now picked up again as she returned to Gondal. Charlotte, though, went back to Brussels in January 1843, despite not enjoying her work and disliking being a Protestant in a Catholic country. She did form an attachment to a married man named Constantine Eyre, who taught her French while she taught him English, but by the end of the year she was ready to go home, where she was rendered miserable by Eyre's neglect of her when he didn't respond to her lovelorn letters. In modern parlance, he ghosted her, and he would later form the basis of the character of Mr. Rochester. As for their brother, after losing his post in the railway service in October 1842 due to a discrepancy in the accounts, he wasn't suspected of stealing though, Branwell became a tutor to the son in the same Robinson family that Anne was working for in January 1843, and had by this point had some success in getting poetry and articles published in local newspapers. In mid-1845, though, he was dismissed from his new post too for having had an affair with the lady of the house. It was this incident which cost his sister her job as well, as she resigned that June. When it became clear to him that Mrs. Robinson would not marry him even after her husband died in 1846, Branwell descended into drink and the abuse of other things. I'm sorry, I'm dancing around YouTube's community guidelines here. And this finally put pay to any ideas of the siblings opening their own school at Haworth. On the upside, from our point of view at least, their dwindling options led them to pursue publishing once again. In the summer of 1845, Charlotte undertook what would become a very important trip. Visiting Ellen Nussey in Hathersage in Derbyshire, she was introduced to the Eyre family, visiting their home at Northlees Hall and hearing the story of how a mad woman had once been housed in a room there. They say authors often write what they know, and many of the details of this holiday would appear in Jane Eyre, with Mr. Rochester's first wife taking on the role of the crazy woman in the attic. That September, Charlotte discovered and read a collection of Emily's poems and was deeply impressed with her sister's abilities. After some prodding, she got Anne and Emily to agree that they would all submit a collection of poems for publication, and this collection, called simply Poems, appeared in May 1846, having been published by Aylett and Jones of Paternoster Row and paid for by the sisters themselves using money inherited from their aunt. It cost them £31 10s. Aware that as women their efforts would be judged on their gender rather than their merit, they opted to use pseudonyms, keeping their initials but transforming into Kerr, Ellis and Acton Bell. Personally, I think this was the best thing to do. I always remember hearing that J.K. Rowling was advised not to publish under her first name so that boys wouldn't know they were reading a book by a woman. And when I published my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, not only did I use a pseudonym, I also employed initials for the exact same reason, so that people seeing the book for the first time who aren't familiar with my YouTube channel wouldn't know I'm a woman. It would be great if at some point female writers didn't feel it mattered if people knew their gender. Although reviewed well, Poems sold only 2 copies, yet this didn't deter the women from publishing again, and each was already working on her own novel. Charlotte had The Professor, Anne had Agnes Grey, and Emily had Wuthering Heights. These were ready by the summer of 1846, and the women were offering them to publishers. The Professor was roundly rejected, but Agnes Grey and Wuthering Heights were eventually accepted by Thomas Cautley Newby in July 1847, though on pretty harsh conditions, for Emily and Anne had to pay £50 towards publication and were only promised payment back if the books did well enough. In the meantime, Charlotte had written Jane Eyre, and it was accepted for publication by Smith, Elder & Co., and actually appeared before her sister's works, coming out in 3 volumes on the 19th of October 1847 under the name Currer Bell. It was a huge success, despite the fact that some critics worried that a relationship between the governess and the master was immoral and even called it unchristian. The book's success encouraged Newby to put out the other two Bell works, and Agnes Grey and Wuthering Heights appeared in December. As this video was inspired by the release of the Margot Robbie version of Wuthering Heights, let's just pause for a minute to briefly consider how Emily's book was written and received. Writing in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, Juliet Barker has noted that the book drew heavily on themes explored in Gondal and said that the characters, Merlin's setting, casual violence, passionate and self-destructive love, and vengeful theme are all typical of Gondal, as is the complete absence of any moral tone or purpose, a quality almost unique in Victorian fiction. It was also set in Yorkshire, and Emily wrote out the Yorkshire accent so precisely in her work that when Charlotte later edited another edition of it, she felt the need to tone it down so that non-Northerners would have an easier time understanding it. The book was pretty scandalous for the time period and did not sell well upon release. Reviewers criticised its violence and general misery, with the Athenaeum saying on Christmas Day 1847 that, in spite of much power and cleverness, in spite of its truth to life in the remote nooks and corners of England, Wuthering Heights is a disagreeable story. The Bells seem to affect painful and exceptional subjects, the misdeeds and depression of tyranny, the eccentricities of woman's fantasy. They do not turn away from dwelling upon these physical acts of cruelty, which we know to have their warrant in the real annals of crime and suffering, but the contemplation of which true taste rejects. The Graham's Ladies magazine said in July 1848 that how a human being could have attempted such a book as the present without committing S, that's a word YouTube doesn't like, before he had finished a dozen chapters is a mystery. It is a compound of vulgar depravity and unnatural horrors. Some were more moderate, giving both praise and criticism. The Examiner of the 8th of February 1848 said that, "This is a strange book. It is not without evidence of considerable power, but as a whole it is wild, confused, disjointed, and improbable. If this book be, as we apprehend it is, the first work of the author, we hope that he will produce a second, giving himself more time in its composition than in the present case, developing his incidents more carefully, eschewing exaggeration and obscurity, and looking steadily at human life under all its moods, for those pictures of the passions that he may desire to sketch for our public benefit. It may be well also to be sparing of certain oaths and phrases which do not materially contribute to any character, and are by no means to be reckoned among the evidences of a writer's genius. We detest the affectation and ephemerate frippery which is but too frequent in the modern novel, and willingly trust ourselves with an author who goes at once fearlessly into the moors and desolate places for his heroes, but we must at the same time stipulate with him that he shall not drag into light all that he discovers, of coarse and loathsome in his wanderings, but simply so much good and ill as he may find necessary to elucidate his history, so much only as may be interwoven inextricably with the persons whom he professes to paint." Others were more complimentary. In a review which Emily herself is known to have kept a copy of, the Morning Post of the 3rd of February 1848 said that, "This is a work of great ability, and contains many chapters to the production of which talent of no common order has contributed. It is not every day that so good a novel makes its appearance, and to give its contents in detail would be depriving many a reader of half the delight he would experience from the perusal of the work itself. To its pages we must refer him then. There will he have ample opportunity of sympathizing, if he has one touch of nature that makes the whole world kin, with the feelings of childhood, youth, manhood, and age, and all the emotions and passions which agitate the restless bosom of humanity. May he derive from it the delight we have ourselves experienced, and be equally grateful to its author for the genuine pleasure he has afforded him." My personal favourite, though, because the reviewer was so wide of the mark, is to be found in the Northern British Review written by James Lorimer, who said, "Here all the faults of Jane Eyre are magnified 1,000-fold, and the only consolation which we have in reflecting upon it is that it will never be generally read." I think that, people, just goes to show that some reviewers, full of their own importance and opinions, are actually idiots who don't know what they're talking about and can't recognise quality when it is literally right in front of them. In one sentence, Lorimer disparaged two of the greatest, most beloved, highly thought of English novels of all time, and made himself look like a backward hick whose stupidity is now immortalised on the internet, probably for many hundreds of years yet to come. Wuthering Heights today has been repeatedly listed as one of the top 100 books of all time, and Emily, who received no payment for it, has had the last laugh over men like Lorimer. Tragically though, like her famous character of Catherine, she would die so young that she wouldn't have the chance to realise it, for shortly after the sisters' work was published, a series of crushing tragedies completely decimated the Brontë family and left it all but extinct by 1855. In 1848, all three sisters had begun work on fresh novels, but their lives were interrupted on the 24th of September that year by the death of their brother Branwell from tuberculosis. He was 31 years old, and his life had long since been blighted by drink problems. He was buried in the family vault at Haworth Church. Emily, now aged 30, seemed to catch a cold at his funeral. In fact, she had TB too, and she never left her home again after burying her brother. Less than 3 months later, she followed him to the grave on the 19th of December. Her final novel, whatever she had written of it, has not survived, and Juliet Barker writes that it was possibly destroyed by Charlotte Brontë, who worried it would damage her sister's posthumous reputation. In June 1848, Anne's second novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, was published, a story of a woman who leaves her abusive husband to protect herself and her son from him. It sold well, despite criticism of its difficult subject matter. Its release brought to a head a little scandal to do with the publisher, though. As no one knew who the three Bell writers really were, Newby decided to pretend that the Bell novels he was publishing, including The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, were all by the same author, Currer Bell, the writer of the runaway success Jane Eyre. This was despite the fact that in the third edition of Jane Eyre, which appeared in April 1848, Charlotte had included a note that this was Currer Bell's only novel. Newby's deception was only finally put to unequivocal rest when Charlotte and Anne went to London in person in July 1848 to demonstrate to Smith Elder & Co. that they were two people and Charlotte was not working with a second publisher. Another tragedy was now stalking the family, though. Just like Branwell and Emily, Anne was now ill with TB. Despite attempts to improve her condition with a trip to Scarborough in May 1849, nothing could save her, and she died there on the 28th of that month and was buried in St Mary's churchyard on Castle Hill in the town 2 days later. Her last words were to the effect that she was glad, quote, death was come and come so gently. She was 29 years old. The brutal 8 months between September 1848 and May 1849 had left only Charlotte and her father Patrick still alive of all the Brontes. I don't imagine I need to tell you how deep their grief was at so many deadly blows in such a short space of time, especially in a family which had always been so tight-knit. If ever you need any evidence of what a tough world Victorian England could be, with little in the way of what we would now recognise as effective medicine, I think you need only look at the Brontë family's experiences. Charlotte wrote of this time that, "A year ago had a prophet warned me how I should stand in June 1849, how stripped and bereaved, had he foretold the autumn, the winter, the spring of sickness and suffering to be gone through, I should have thought, this can never be endured." Endure she would, though, and the last of the Brontë siblings now had to go it alone. Charlotte had a new novel called Shirley to offer her some distraction, and it was completed in August with the main character based somewhat on Emily. It was published on the 26th of October, again under the name Currer Bell, but readers were desperate to know the real identities of the Bell siblings and did finally figure out who Charlotte was. This led to her becoming something of a celebrity, who was brought into literary circles despite being painfully shy and overawed by the people she met, including William Thackeray in London in November 1849. More trips to London, Edinburgh and Windermere followed over the next 2 years or so. She was described by fellow writer Harriet Montagu, who she met during this time, as the smallest creature I had ever seen except at a fair, and her eyes blazed, while Thackeray recalled the trembling little frame, the little hand, the great honest eyes. Charlotte turned down a third marriage proposal from James Taylor, who worked at her publisher's house. Really, she was doing very well on that front despite her supposed physical drawbacks. She also edited new editions of Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey, which appeared in December 1850 and were finally published under Emily and Anne's real names. She had a new project of her own too, called Villette, which was published on the 29th of January 1853. In setting, theme and characterisation, it drew on her time as a teacher, her stint in Brussels, her love for Constantine Eyre, and some of her new acquaintances, including her publisher George Smith. It was to be Charlotte's final book. She earned £500 for it and only ever made about £1,500 in her publishing career, according to Christine Alexander, writing in the Oxford DMB. That would be about £167,000 today, a fraction of the money her books have made. Her fourth proposal of marriage came from the Irishman Arthur Bell Nichols, who was her father's curate and who Charlotte was surprised to acquire a declaration of love from. Patrick Brontë, perhaps motivated by snobbery, he'd done a lot to put his Irish roots behind him after all, and Charlotte was now a celebrated novelist, did not support the match. But although it took Charlotte a little time to warm to the idea, she decided to wed Arthur, and Patrick came around. They were married in Haworth Church on the 29th of June 1854 and came to Ireland for their honeymoon. Charlotte took to marriage quite well and was finally somewhat happy again after the terrible losses of previous years and the strain of having to perform as a famous writer. She had started another novel before the wedding called Emma. I wonder if she would have changed the name to avoid confusion with Jane Austen's work of the same name, but abandoned it once she was Mrs. Nichols. As ever, though, death had its eye on the Brontë family, and Charlotte, trying to rebuild a new family for herself after her losses, was now in its sights. She became pregnant within a few months, but suffered from terrible morning sickness. In fact, it is now generally accepted that she had hyperemesis gravidarum, which you may recall hospitalised Princess Catherine during her first pregnancy and knocked her for 6 with her second and third as well. It is a very severe complication, and without modern treatments like anti-nausea medications and IVs, it can absolutely kill, and kill Charlotte Brontë it did. Badly weakened and still only 5 months into the pregnancy, she caught a chill which she may have been able to fight off had she not been so run down from the morning sickness. Instead, she died on the 31st of March 1855, aged just 38. She too was buried in Haworth Church. Her father Patrick, who had now outlived his wife and all 6 of his children, lived on until 1861 when he died of bronchitis and was buried in Haworth as well. Her widower Arthur, who had lived with Patrick Brontë after Charlotte's demise, survived until 1906. He inherited the copyright to his wife's works, did what he could to protect her legacy, but ultimately moved back to Ireland after his father-in-law's death, where he remarried in 1864 and lived out the rest of his life, having been permanently overshadowed by his famous wife and sisters-in-law. And that, my friends, is the story of the Brontë sisters and their family, a tale of genius, isolation, and repeated tragedies, out of which came some of the greatest works of fiction in English history. I hope you found that overview of their lives interesting. I've left links to an audiobook and original reviews of Wuthering Heights in the description box for you, as well as to my website, historycallingofficial.com, where you can sign up to my free newsletter and get 2 complimentary downloads right away. Let me know in the comments if you're planning to watch the Margot Robbie movie, or alternatively, what your favourite Brontë book is. For more literary history, check out my video on the story of how Pride and Prejudice came into the world, or for something a little spicier, see my episode all about how historical fiction is misleading millions. Until next time all, keep learning.